Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. We have a current issues panel with us today, a regular feature here on the show, where we strive to have varying viewpoints on a variety of newsy items. And of course, I'm going to chime in from time to time to share my own opinions as well. Well, returning today is conservative commentator Brock Stephenson and Elliot Hughes from Summa Strategies. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. Again, we have some newsy, some not so interesting items as well. Actually, I'm going to start with this, and we can just kind of dismiss with this issue right away. There was a Globe and Mail op-ed written in which the author compared her experience of living in a Canadian lockdown to that of Anne Frank's experience during the Holocaust. And immediately when I saw this, I said, this is so tone deaf. And how one can compare that to living and being at the precipice of basically being locked in, how Anne Frank was, and then facing death, and then actually being murdered in the Holocaust is shocking to me. I assume you both agree with me. Brock, do you want to start?
Yes, I do agree. I think the challenge there is the Globe and Mail shows yet another reason why newspapers are declining. The author's attempt at creative writing isn't suited for the editorial page. It was probably a case of poor taste on both the author's part and the newspaper's part, but I think that in general, being trapped in a corner of a home in 1940s is a lot different than our challenge nowadays.
I'll let you chime in, Elliot. What do you have to say about this?
Yeah, not much to really add. I mean, there was an unfortunate opinion to take. There's probably a kernel of understanding in there, in that it's been tough to live in the pandemic, but to then go on to compare it to something that many of us cannot even begin to fathom was really off base.
And I think I'll chime in as well. I've mentioned that I found this appalling, but I will say this: throughout the lockdowns, as we've experienced since last March, throughout the COVID era of COVID, many of us in Canada have griped and complained about various things. Some because it infringes on our civil liberties, and of course those should be protected and promoted and all that. But others have just complained about, if we had to, wait in an extra line, or if we had to do something else different, or jump through this hoop. But then I think, maybe this sounds cliche, but I think of those living in the third world who have to walk a whole mile just to access clean drinking water, and how that must be for them. And so if we experience this kernel of suffering here during this lockdown, justified or unjustified, that's a separate matter. It is nothing in comparison to how so many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people live around the world. And again, there's an element of tone deafness here. And I think, I don't know, I was surprised to see this published in a Canadian paper, to be quite frank. I was just shocked by it. Okay, let's move on. We have seen a report that Canada has not met the threshold to declare an influenza outbreak during this flu season. There have been so few cases that not even the National Microbiology Lab has been able to obtain samples of flus this season. What are your thoughts, Elliot? Is there something that we're missing here?
Well, I think it shows that masks work, and that some of the measures that we've put into place for COVID have trickled into and protected us from what is normally a pretty tough season for flu. So we have remained indoors, we have socially distanced, we have used masks, washed our hands. These are all things that we could be doing if we wanted to avoid the flu a little bit more, if the flu was a little bit more deadly. And so there are some additional benefits to keeping up these masses, reducing COVID, but also getting rid of the flu. Now, we'll see if that continues. But certainly, I guess, an ounce of good news from what we've been going through the last couple of months.
Brock, what do you have to say?
It's very nice to have a silver lining to the last year. And if it's a reduced case of influenza, we'll have to take it. I think it's good that our school children and our most vulnerable seniors are not having outbreaks this year on top of coronavirus. And I think that's a positive. Hopefully we have such a good year, the microbiology lab doesn't get some samples, but if they do, hopefully they can use it for their research.
Okay, so my take on this is, and I agree with you, especially Elliot, where you say, well, because we have kept ourselves distant, because we have locked ourselves indoors, for lack of a better term, then of course we wouldn't be sharing germs. So of course it would reduce transmission of any virus, including the COVID virus. So I guess when we return from this commercial break, I'm going to ask you, is this the new path forward to avoid future flu outbreaks? We'll pick this up right when we return. Welcome back. We're joined with our current issues panel with Brock Stephenson and Elliot Hughes. Just before we went to commercial break, I left you with some thoughts and some questions. We have seen studies now or news that we have so far not experienced a flu outbreak this year, which is our normal time for a flu, the start of the flu season. We have not experienced that. The National Microbiology Lab has not collected any flu samples. There's been no flu. And we were suggesting that that's because we've been socially distancing. Some people say because we've been masking. Really, I think it's because we haven't been mingling. I mean, when was the last time you had coffee or drinks with a friend at a crowded bar? I haven't done that in over a year. Well, I guess about a year. So is this the new way forward? I'm asking this because if we're going to try to, we have a socialized healthcare in Canada, and if we're going to try to keep, our ERs from being overwhelmed, is this actually perhaps the new normal, that when it's the peak of some kind of virus season, that we are going to engage in social distancing? Is this a good policy, Elliot?
I think there are lessons that we can take away from the COVID pandemic for sure and apply them to the flu season. I think, increased washing of hands is one of them. Whether we go the distance that we've gone with COVID is, I guess, another question. I hope not. But there are certainly some small things that I think we can pick up on. Wearing of masks in public, using public transportation is quite common in many parts of the world. And perhaps that becomes a little bit more common here in Canada and North America. But certainly there's a few things I'm sure that we can pick up. I think hand washing is probably the biggest takeaway that we can apply going forward.
Yeah, I'm not sure how good I feel about wearing masks on public transit. I mean, I think we were all thinking this is temporary going forward. Yes, sure, in certain parts of the world that might be the normal. I wouldn't be happy with that. Brock, your thoughts?
I think there's been some permanent changes in North American society, but I suspect that once we're through this vaccination wave, that things will return mostly to normal.
Okay.
I don't expect North Americans mostly to be mask wearers like they are in East Asia in some cases, but I think that this is something that has benefited for this 1 year. We'll see how it goes in the future.
We'll have to.
Go ahead. I just jump in there? There was a poll actually that came out today out of the U.S. where it suggested, I think that over 3/4 of Americans are going to wear masks longer than perhaps the pandemic is ongoing. So it'll be interesting to watch whether or not this does trickle into more day-to-day behavior and it becomes more of the norm. Whether it becomes something that you need to wear if you're going on to public transit, that's I think a slightly different question.
Right.
But certainly to protect oneself, there may be just a desire to want to do it regardless.
Well, that's actually a very good point you brought up, Elliot, that people may choose on their own volition to wear masks long term. And that's a personal decision I support. If people feel they have to take certain healthcare measures for their own protection of their health, by all means, I'm all for the individual making the choices that they feel they have to for themselves, for their family. My concern is the imposition of forced healthcare measures. So, for example, you can't, for the next, say, 4 years, you're not going to be able to go into a store if you don't have a mask or something of the sort. I think it is important that families make their own healthcare choices. For example, during winter season, frequently, when I had young children, I would be very leery of having playdates in the house because inevitably there will be a child visiting who was sick, and then it would work its way through my family, and then I had to deal with all that. And sometimes it was just easier just not to mingle with other families with younger kids. So we'll have to see what happens with that going forward. Okay, let's move on to another interesting story. So for 20 years, there have been no changes to the Canadian Divorce Act. But finally, again, 20 years later, we finally have the first substantive amendments that have just come into place in March. And for now, including a few other things, judges, when they establish custody and take into consideration arrangements, they're going to take into consideration the prospect of violence, including a child's direct and indirect exposure to family violence, which I think is important. Brock, I'll let you have the first dibs on that. What do you think about these new amendments?
Violence and abuse are completely unacceptable. I think children should obviously come first. In most cases, both the parents deserve some custody rights. I think there's a variety of choices nowadays. It's not just a traditional primary parent custody.
Right.
I think each family has their own cases, but I think that with the case of violence and abuse, there should be zero tolerance.
Brock, or Elliot, rather?
Yeah, a lot of laws in Canada, including this one, were written decades ago, and times have changed, and laws need to be kept up to date. And so that evergreen process of going through them and adapting them and adapting to where society has changed is super important. So it's great to see that this is happening now, particularly for this such an important piece of legislation. I think they've taken the right approach here, which is a child-centric approach to making sure that they get this right going forward.
Welcome back. Once again, we're joined by Brock Stephenson, Conservative commentator, and from Summa Strategies, Elliot Hughes. Just before commercial, we were discussing the 20 years in the making, I suppose you could say, first amendments in 20 years to the Divorce Act. That's a federal act. And reflecting that now it's going to take into consideration family violence and things that are listed as in the definition of violence. We reflect back on the deaths of Chloe and Aubrey Berry in 2017, and these two young girls were brutally murdered by their father, and was a very hostile custody situation. And children are defenseless, right? Children are defenseless, and we as adults have to be their advocates. And some divorces are exceptionally messy, and I think it's generally a good move. What has happened here, that taking children's safety into account when looking at arranging equal parenting is a good idea. I do have one concern, and maybe I'm being alarmist, but I have one concern. So the government is now judges are now going to take into consideration the presence and prospect of violence. But who gets to decide what's considered violent? And I know that sounds strange, but what is considered violent? What is defined as the word of abuse? And I ask this because I recall back in 2017, in Ontario, the former Minister of Child and Youth Services said that he would consider it abuse if a parent with a gender-confused child suggested to them that, perhaps they're not transgendered or they might want to think about it, that he said that he would consider that abuse and he would take away the child until that abuse stopped. So my only concern is, does this open up that can of worms? Elliot, do you have any comment?
Certainly tricky territory and tricky ground. I think it's one of those issues that's going to take time to think through. This process of examining the law and at least putting some amendments forward is the step in the right direction. But as you rightly point out, I mean, this needs to be constantly evolving. There's going to be situations that develop in certain circumstances that haven't been encountered to date. And so it's important that government, I think, continues to work on bills like this and other bills, and so that really reflects society today rather than society when they were first written.
True. And again, considering parental rights and all this, obviously, like physical violence and what we saw happened with the Berry daughters, I mean, that was atrocious. But again, it's who's the arbiter of what is violence, what is abuse. And again, sometimes some people might say, okay, well, if you don't let your son or daughter engage in transgender behavior, then that's considered abuse. And we've heard it from an Ontario minister. Brock, again, I'm asking this because there was a father out in British Columbia, Mr. Hoogland, whose daughter or son was removed from him because he refused to allow her to go engage in hormonal therapies. Would that be considered violent? Is that a potential under this legislation, under this new amendments into the Divorce Act?
I think we have to be very careful with these new amendments. I think we're going to have to keep an eye on the courts, keep an eye on what Parliament decides. And with that, I think that parents should be responsible for their families and while children are minors, unless there's a fully harmful situation, it's the parents that are the ultimate responsibility holders for their children.
And I think these amendments, at least in the terms of physical violence, couldn't have come at a better time. We know that the spikes in violence, domestic abuse, have just gone through the roof due to lockdowns, due to the COVID pandemic. So we're only starting to see what that real secondary pandemic, if you will, is looking like. Anyways, let's change topics for a second. Speaking again of the COVID, I feel like we always talk about COVID issues. COVID vaccine passports. I know this is something that we've seen thrown around in the media, usually in Europe or some faraway place. But finally, it seems that Canada or Canadian leaders and Canadian politicians are starting to discuss the possibility of there being vaccine COVID vaccine passports as a potential tool to help get society out of lockdown here in Canada. Brock, do you think this is something that we're on the precipice of seeing, or what?
I think it could happen. I really am concerned that we struggle both with security and freedom here in Canada. I think that we have had vaccines with passports in the past, decades ago, for various other illnesses, but we need to be careful. We should hope for the best and prepare for the worst. We don't want to be left behind when our international partners decide that's the direction they're heading in. Canada should be prepared. We've had trouble being prepared with international travel. We only got the current regime in December and then had some struggles with the quarantine hotel scheme. I think we need to work with the international community, figure out our plans so that we're not left behind.
That's a fair point. I guess my counter thought to that would be, well, shouldn't Canada make up its own decisions for its own country? Sure, yes, when you're dealing with international travel, obviously that would have implications. But, is it not our responsibility of our government to advocate for the rights of our citizens, both domestic and abroad? Something that we're going to delve into further right when we return from this commercial break. So please stick around. Welcome back. We're wrapping up today's episode with our current issues panel with Brock Stephenson and Elliot Hughes. Recently, as we were discussing before the commercial break, we're talking about COVID passports. And recently, Health Canada said that governments and international bodies around the world are exploring the possibility and the use of vaccine certificates as a tool to support the reopening of societies and economies. And furthermore, they said any similar consideration in the Canadian context would have to be based on reliable scientific evidence. So that is a very interesting statement. Again, if you asked me a year ago, would we have COVID passport? I'd be like, what are you discussing? But now a year later, I think this is a very real thing. And we've already seen the UK discuss this. Boris Johnson, we've seen the EU community discuss of having these COVID passports. The concern is, how would that look like? What would a COVID passport look like when it is the provinces who really keep track of immunization records? Elliot, do you have any insight into what that would look like?
Well, I think you're right in raising some ethical concerns. I think there's still a lot to figure out here. I think when someone says vaccine passport, you probably have there are probably one opinion for every person on what that actually means. But to Brock's point earlier, there are lots of countries in the world in which you can't get into unless you have a vaccine for the yellow fever vaccine or other types of vaccine. This is quite common. So again, this might be something that we may not be familiar with on a day-to-day basis, but it's common internationally, and there are sometimes that's going to come to our very shores as well, and we need to be prepared for that. But to your point, lots of questions to answer first, lots of thorny issues to work through. So we're nowhere near the end on this one. I think we're very much at the beginning.
And of course, when I think about how practically the practical implications of such a thing would be, so, okay, fine, you might not be able to visit another country because they have their own health measures, and they're free to implement those. That's their, sovereign right, if you will. But then for Canadians re-entering Canada, will they be required to have proof of immunizations? I think towards immunocompromised groups of Canadians who simply are unable to obtain vaccines because they don't want to, because they're already immunocompromised. There's secondary health considerations there. We do have conscientious objections within schools for children whose parents decide, we can't, for religious grounds or health reasons, get a vaccine. They simply get a form signed and that's the end of it. Brock, how would COVID passports, would vaccine passports unduly impact one group versus another?
It probably would. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution. I think Canada needs to advocate for our citizens and make sure that we have a plan. I think our problem has been that we've been slow to the table on having a plan, both federally and provincially, on a lot of these cases.
Well, the interesting news is Canada, we seem to be on an upward trajectory for vaccine delivery. So for those who really want the vaccine, it looks like there's good hope. It's coming faster and faster. Already, as recent as this weekend, I read that 2.4 million doses have been administered, up about 2.4 million. That's quite a lot compared to where we were just a few weeks ago. Things were very slow a few weeks ago. Now we're getting we're getting up to speed, if you will, like with the rest of the world on where we should be. But again, I think about the rights of personal privacy. Some people don't want the vaccine. There is research that shows somewhere of up towards 50% of even frontline healthcare workers are concerned about this vaccine. So again, I ask, if there's this much hesitations with vaccines, how could we even be thinking of having a COVID vaccine passport? Elliot?
Well, I mean, just to challenge that premise, I think it's been proven quite clearly globally that these vaccines are safe and reliable and do its job of reducing the chances of going into a hospital and death. So I think from the medical side of things, they are clearly effective and doing their job. Whether there are other questions around, do people want to take them, and are there other reasons why they may not want to take them? That's understandable. And I think that's an issue that we've faced in the past, and it's going to be one that we face with COVID vaccine as well. But as I said earlier, we're at the beginning of this vaccine passport journey. Other countries are moving quickly, and the challenge is if we don't get on board quickly enough, we may miss that train. And in a world where things are moving quickly, Canada also needs to keep up.
Very good points. Okay, gentlemen, we've run out of time, but thanks again for joining me for a lively panel. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Lots to unpack here, and I'm glad again we had the Current Issues panel to help us delve into some of these topics. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.